So Dr. Blumenthal, you really made a compulsive case for continuing research about it. It is something that is obviously shocking when we hear this. You talked about the Klimt. The Klimt is will be also part of our, let's say, will be part of our next lecture. The next lecture will be touched, not really in a sense, but it will be touched the aspect of looted art, but not in Austria, more in Israel. And as it is largely known, the topic of looted art is an open topic still. It's a current topic, it's a pressuring topic, not only in Germany, but also in many other European countries and the US. It is one of the areas in which Nazi injustice perpetuates still today. And the presentation that we will hear in a moment from Dr. Kochavi will focus on Israel's perspective on Nazi looted art. Dr. Kochavi received her PhD from the University of Leeds and holds an MA in History and Business of Art and Collection from the Institut d'études supérieures des arts in Paris, and a second MA in Law and Studies from Bar-Ilan University in Israel. Her professional experience includes curatorial positions at the Magnus Collection of Jewish Art and Life at UC Berkeley, where she has been involved in the curation of exhibitions and research of Jewish artifacts in the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. Prior to her curatorial work, Dr. Kochavi filled positions at the Contemporary Art and Antique Galleries in Israel and the UK, as well as at Christie's Auction House. In between 2010 and 2014, she worked as a provenance researcher at the Company for Location and Restitution of Holocaust Victim Assets in Israel. The title of her lecture is The Art Restitution and National Responsibility, Israel's Shifting Policy Towards Nazi Looted Art. Dr. Kochavi, please take the floor.
Allow me to begin, like my fellow speakers, by thanking the conference organizers, Professor Stauber, the Claims Conference. I am delighted to be here and honored to speak to this distinguished guest list. Since our time is short, I'll jump straight into it. In 1998, members of the Israeli delegation to the Washington Conference on Nazi Confiscated Art opened their statement by making it clear that the state of Israel, the Jewish state, sees itself as the central representative of the survivors and their offspring, and is dedicated to achieving justice on their behalf and to the remembrance of the Holocaust. Thus stressing that Israel remains consistent with the post-war attitude as the main country in place that stands for Holocaust victims and survivors and Holocaust remembrers. In late 1930s, when news of the Nazi regime's organized destruction of European Jewry began arriving into Palestine, several key members of the Yishuv identified it as a crucial moment to save Jewish life and culture. In this presentation, I will try to briefly focus on the moral issues and legislation surrounding the restitution of Jewish cultural objects after the founding of the State of Israel. Many of the items shipped to Israel were titled heirless, indicating that their pre-war owners were unidentified, unknown, or haven't been found yet. These images that you see here are all, as you see on the bottom, from the data bank of the Central Collecting Point in Munich. What was in Munich. Since the time is limited, I only chose a few key examples to represent the transition taking place in Israeli society from the moment the state identified itself as the rightful heir to Holocaust victims' assets to the reinterpretation of the concept of restitution and addressing the need for individual restitution to the rightful heirs of the victims. By the end of World War II, as the Allied forces continuously discovered caches of confiscated cultural property, a need to make urgent decisions about the property's future led to the founding of a successor organization, the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization, which you see on the top here. The organization was later joined by a second organization set up in order to handle Jewish cultural objects, the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction. The two organizations signed an agreement in August 1947 in which the JCR, the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, agreed to act as the agent of the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization in tracing, restituting, and allocating Jewish books, Jewish ceremonial objects, and other Jewish cultural property found primarily in the United States occupied zone in Germany. An important part of the decision-making was made with the help of various experts who were called by these organizations to join the monuments, fine art, and archives men and women, which some of you probably heard of, in the process of identification of the properties discovered and determining their future. Of these experts who arrived from Israel are, for example, philosopher and historian Gershom Scholem, who was sent on behalf of the National Library of Israel, and Mordechai Narkis, head of the National Betzalel Museum in Jerusalem, the predecessor of the Israel Museum. Narkis ended up being responsible for the shipping of Jewish ritual objects and works of art that later made their way to synagogues, memorial sites, and museums, primarily Betzalel, in Israel. In many of his letters, Narkis described the conditions in which he was working at the central collecting points and the intense feelings he experienced when coming across the various types of objects. And here I put a short quote in English and Hebrew. I'll just read the English part. "My heart is bleeding and I am working. Everything that has been collected here at the Wiesbaden Museum is only a fragment of what the despicable took from Hungary, as I see it. And everything is counted in thousands and shows the state of our culture. The few objects removed from Germany were shuttered with hammers, and those were the most beautiful and ancient of the pieces." Narkis also mentioned the moral obligation he felt compelled to fulfill, as many others did at the time, while seeing Israel as the main heir to the unclaimed or heirless property of Holocaust victims. The devastating situation in Europe at the end of the war also brought other museum representatives from Israel to visit main European cities. These visits were mostly aimed at trying to collect and bring back with them to Israel remnants of pre-war Jewish life and testimonies of the destruction of European Jewry. Thus, for example, Chaim Gamzo, director of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art at the time, Chaim Attar, director of the Ein Harod Museum of Art, and Narkis all found themselves scrambling for funds to purchase various artworks that were put on sale on Paris auction houses whose pre-war owners were unknown. Miriam Novich, one of the founders of the Ghetto Fighters House Museum and Archive, also made efforts to connect with artists who survived the Holocaust for donations of their works to the museum, for example. In 1957, Narkis passed away unexpectedly. And less than a decade later, in 1965, the Israel Museum opened its doors. At the time, the entire collection from the Betzalel Museum was making its way to become part of the new national institution. By 1965, a few of the heirless works of art were restituted to heirs who made efforts to contact the German Restitution Office, the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization, and the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction offices in Frankfurt and New York. Jewish Cultural Reconstruction personnel had a difficult time trying to identify the items requested. However, the process, even for the few works that were restituted, was slow, unorganized, and eventually led to very, very little success and mostly frustration. Despite several international efforts that took place from the 1950s on the protection of property during war, it was only during the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, the publication of research on Nazi-looted art, and the class lawsuits that took place in American courts against Swiss banks and European insurance companies, that international conferences began discussing the issue of restitution of Nazi-looted art. In 1998, more than 40 governments, as well as cultural institutions, sent representatives to the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era assets that concluded with publishing a list of 11 principles. Here they are. The principles offer a process that aims at identifying the heirs and reaching a fair and just solution. They include, for example, stages in which research and resources are necessary, as well as the database and the publication of research information. Like other treaties and conference resolution, the Washington Principles are non-binding concepts, which were agreed upon by the conference participants and signatories. As such, only a few countries have proven to actively implement them into their national legal processes. Several following conferences expressed support of the Washington Principles. The Vilnius Forum Declaration of 2000, which opens by requesting governments to undertake every reasonable effort to achieve the restitution of cultural assets looted during the Holocaust era to the original owners or their heirs. In 2003, the European Parliament stressed this even further, and in 2009, the Terezin Conference Declaration reiterated the Washington Principles and specifically governments' responsibility to reach fair and just solutions. And of course, it goes on. In 2018, the conference titled 20 Years to the Washington Principles took place in Berlin. Afterwards, a joint declaration by the federal German government and the United States government was issued, reinforcing the country's commitment to follow the Washington Principles. And at the same year, a conference took place in Jerusalem that issued another declaration that called museums to identify Nazi-looted art in the collections, and for countries and museums to make a firm commitment to take the appropriate legal steps to return the works of art to their rightful owners when claims for restitution are filed. The statement also addresses commemoration and education. We believe that this approach can help in education about and commemoration of the Holocaust and tell the story of the destruction of the cultural life of the Jewish people perpetrated by the Nazis. 5 countries implemented the Washington Principles by establishing national commissions to research works of art in public and national collections and provide a mechanism to facilitate restitution: Austria, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. And I'm not going to expand on them because I have no time. Back in Israel, the Israel Museum is the only national art museum in Israel. The museum was opened in May 1965 to the public, and at the time inherited the B'Tselem Museum collection that included, as I said, several hundreds of airless works of art that arrived in Israel in the early 1950s, originally from central collecting points. The Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Policy called for the redistribution of Jewish cultural items as following: 40% went to Israel, 40% went to the United States, and the remaining 20% was divided between Jewish communities in the Western Hemisphere. The majority of objects arrived in Israel were essentially put in storage, while a few were sold or even exchanged locally. In 1965, upon the museum's grand opening, there was actually no formal legislation that focused on art institutions and museums in Israel. To give an example, the museums law, which defines museums, collections, and describes their responsibilities and functions, was only legislated in 1983. The law has no descriptive reference to research, display, or collecting due diligence. It does state, as I quoted here, the museum management is obligated to conserve artifacts, care for them, and display them to the public appropriately, register, describe, and photograph every item in the collection, provide the public with information about the items in the museum, publish catalogs and other publication. The museum, the Israel Museum that is, made a significant shift towards the display and publication of information about what became known as the YRSO, or JRSO, Jewish Restitution Success Organization collection, when in 2007, its website was first shared with the public. The following year, in 2000, and this is the example of what the website looks like today, and it's a searchable website. I invite you all to log in and do a search for yourselves. The following year, in 2008, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem opened 2 exhibitions: Orphaned Art, looted art from the Holocaust in the Israel Museum, and Looking for Owners, Custody, Research, and Restitution of Art Stolen in France during World War II. A collaboration with the French government, which made a significant turning point in the public discussion on the topic and on Israel's responsibility towards the heirs and the expected role it plays in Nazi-looted art restitution. The exhibition's opening was accompanied by a 2-day conference called Justice Matters. As a condition to the loan, France demanded certain securities to prevent objects from potentially being seized in Israel. In response to France's demand, Israel passed in 2007 the Loan of Cultural Properties Jurisdiction Restriction Law, which enables the loan of cultural objects of public interest without causing damage to the rights of the Jewish people to objects confiscated during the Holocaust. This essentially means that Israeli courts have no authority in such cases, and any claim will be processed in the country that gave the items on loan, thus making sure the objects would be returned to their country of origin once the exhibition concluded. This legislation was not created in a void. It was a direct result of the restitution case regarding the Egon Schiele painting, Portrait of Wally, that took place in New York in the early 2000s, after the work was given on loan by the Leopold Museum in Vienna to the MoMA in 1997, and another interesting case that I will not expand on. Although this legislation caused much criticism in Israeli society, by passing this law, Israel did join other countries, like, for example, the United Kingdom, which the same year passed a similar law in order to enable an exhibition of French paintings from Russian collections to the Royal Academy. Since then, the Israel Museum has been the main cultural organization in Israel that has been known to conduct provenance research, and it publishes information about restituted works of art from the collection. I will only note that among the items that entered the museum collection in the 1950s are also Jewish ritual items, some of which are still being contested today by heirs and re-established Jewish communities. The decade of the 2000s can be described as a period of transition in terms of Israel's own responsibility towards restitution of Nazi-looted art and other properties. In 2000, a parliamentary legislative committee led by Knesset member Coletta Vital, who was here and hopefully might still be here, was established. In 2004, the committee published its findings in a report that led in 2006 to the legislation of the Assets Law, or in its full name, the Holocaust Victims Assets Law, Restitution to Heirs and Dedication for Assistance and Commemoration. The law designated an external organization, the Company for Location and Restitution of Holocaust Victims' Assets, to be set up for the purpose of locating properties in Israel belonging to Holocaust victims, identifying their heirs, and performing restitution. Properties whose owners remained unidentified were transferred to provide assistance to living Holocaust survivors in Israel, and the remainder was donated for educational and commemorative purposes. As part of its responsibilities, the company was to independently initiate and conduct research on various types of property, initially on immovable property, such as bank accounts, plots of lands, etc., and it also developed into research on art and cultural properties. As part of this effort, and in order to raise awareness to the topic, the company organized 2 conferences focused on cultural property located in Israel in 2014 and in 2015. Following the company's work and with its support, in 2014, the Israel office of ICOM is the International Council of Museums, conducted a roundtable meeting that published its conclusions online. Unfortunately, since then, very little has been done and very little follow-up has been done by the Israeli ICOM leadership. I will just remind us that ICOM is an organization which encourages museums to join and participate in the promotion of partnerships, knowledge, and engage in a dialogue. It, however, can't legally enforce its decisions. In 1986, ICOM published this first code of ethics, which was updated in 2006. And these are just a couple of quotes that address provenance research. One of the highlights of the 2015 conference organized by the Company of Location and Restitution of Holocaust Victims' Assets was the identification of a Nazi-looted artwork in the collection of the Ein Harod Museum of Art. The beggar, which you see here, by Polish-Jewish artist Eugene Zak, was discovered to have been looted from a Jewish family in Paris. Following this case, 3 works of art, a painting, and 2 17th century tapestries have also been identified in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art and restituted to the heirs of Rudolf Mose, a prominent Jewish publisher from Berlin who amassed a comprehensive personal collection. And similar to the Ein Harod Museum case, this research was also, and the discovery was also done by an external researcher and an external organization to the cultural institution in which the works of art exist, or existed at the time. In 2021, the Israeli Ministry of Justice, along with the Ministry of Culture and Sport and the Office of Social Justice, led an online conference on Nazi-looted art provenance research in Israel. At the conference, several participants called for the urgent need for Israel to take responsibility, as it often expects of other countries, and to act on the matter promptly, thus ensuring that Nazi-looted cultural items located in Israel will be identified, researched, and restituted. A year later, an update on the work of the working group was shared with the conference participants and explained a few setbacks that were taking place in the process. Despite that, several cultural institutions are expressing interest in conducting provenance research on items in their collections, but there is yet a lot to be done. To conclude, since the 2000s, there's been a shift in opinion. From a moral perspective, identifying Israel as the rightful heir, towards supporting the rights of individual heirs. A legal framework, however, supporting these rights at the moment is virtually not existent in Israel. In practice, cultural institutions are yet to have dedicated funded provenance research position. Thus, those who are conducting such research often do it voluntarily. Public-facing databases, which are few, aren't being regularly updated, thus making it impossible for researchers and potential claimants to have updated information available. There is no central database and no indication in terms of either the relevant where the relevant archival materials are available for researchers, at museums or any other cultural institutions, and of any collections that actually need to be investigated. In addition, there is an ongoing public debate on the question whether Israel should remain the so-called rightful heir to the heirless object or not, a view that relies on circumstances taking place over 70 years ago and hardly represents the situation today, as several heirs have been successful in restituting objects that belonged to their ancestors before the war worldwide. We must maybe ask ourselves at this moment in time, what will happen in the near future and what can be done? Where does Israel stand in terms of restitution? What policies could assist in creating a formal restitution process, since the informal one has had very limited success so far? Should the government be involved, and to what capacity? The Company for Location and Restitution of Holocaust Victims' Assets has been closed since 2017, and the responsibility over the remaining assets was taken over by the custodian of absentee properties under the Ministry of Justice. Is Israel prepared to set up a national spoliation committee, as in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Austria, Germany, and France? How would it be funded? Who would be sitting on such a committee? And how could they enforce their decisions? These are all questions that should be addressed promptly by cultural and government leaders as the generation of Holocaust survivors departs this world, and we remain responsible to correct the injustices of the past and to return the heirs their family heirlooms, giving them the opportunity to fulfill and conclude their ancestors' last wills. Thank you.